Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the marvelous auditorium here. Hopefully you've all had plenty of time at this point to enjoy some Peruvian cuisine and also some of the entertainment in the food tent next door. Hopefully we'll have you out of here in time to enjoy that. But before then, we wanted to talk today about a key subject, inequality, and the implications it has for growth and structural reforms. Now, obviously, since the financial crisis, there had been hopes that the gap between the rich and poor would narrow. Those hopes have not necessarily materialized. And of course, we've heard here this week from the IMF and their World Economic Outlook that growth is slowing. So the question for our panelists here today to discuss is, how do you address inequality in a period of slower growth? And what structural reforms can be used to try and achieve both goals? First of all, I'd like to introduce this wonderful group of panelists who've been assembled here. Now, to my left here, Winnie Benyama from Oxfam joins me, Min Zhu, the IMF Deputy Managing Director, Nobel laureate, economist, Joseph Stiglitz, and from the world of politics, we're joined by Jeroen Dijsselbloem, Dutch Finance Minister and Eurogroup President, and last but not least, Luis Videgaray, Mexico's Finance Minister. Now, we're starting to see that there's growing evidence that when a rich country gets richer, a country's economic health can suffer. At the same time, though, there's a view that structural reforms can boost growth, but they may also be bad for inequality. And I wanted to start really with the sort of that concept to see whether or not you agree with that. Joseph Stiglitz, if you could talk a bit more on that.
Well, first, the term structural reforms is just a big basket of everything that, if you're not talking about tax cuts or expenditure cuts or tax rises, you call it structural reform. And so it really doesn't mean very much. Let me illustrate. For instance, in the United States, we began some structural reforms back in 1980 with President Reagan. And those structural reforms were deregulation, particularly the financial sector, lowering of the taxes. You might call those structural reforms. What was the result? The result was a third of a century later, all the growth went to the top 10%. The bottom 90% of America has seen no increase in their income. So you can call that a structural reform that did two things. Slow growth, didn't increase growth, it's slow growth, and it had an enormous increase effect in inequality to the point where median income today is lower than it was a quarter century ago. A structural reform that undid that rewrote the rules of the market economy, changed corporate governance, changed the financial sector, the excessive financialization, raised income taxes, especially on rents, speculative rents that divert resources into land speculation rather than into wealth creation. A whole set of reforms of that kind can increase inequality, decrease inequality, and increase economic growth. So the right reforms can do both. The wrong reforms can destroy both. They're both called structural reforms.
Minister, if I could bring you in here, Minister Dijsselbloem, do you agree, or how would you define structural reforms?
Well, I agree with Professor Stiglitz. It's a very broad sort of theme. So the answer to your question would be, it depends very much on the issues that you're going to reform, and especially the design. We've done reforms in my country, in the Netherlands, of the healthcare system, the pension system, the educational system, all of which I think in the end will strengthen our social welfare state and contribute to the high level of equality in our society, which we have in the Netherlands. But it very much depends on how you design them. We had flaws in our pension system, which basically meant that a number of pensioners at the moment couldn't get the rights that they had expected, and future generations were paying a lot, but were very uncertain whether they would get pension in the end. We've addressed these issues, made the pension system much more sustainable, which especially for the lower incomes in our society is crucial. It's about the state pension and the second pillar pension. So, short answer, it very much depends on how you approach the issues and how you design them, whether it influences in a positive or negative way equality in society.
Rinzu, if I could bring you in here, this idea of trade-offs, I mean, are there sometimes difficult choices to be made when you're considering structural reforms? Do you have to choose between growth and inequality?
Well, first of all, I think I agree with Jill and Minister. I think it's very difficult to against a Nobel Prize lower. But let me try a little bit of yes, Jill says that structural reform can promote both growth and equity, and that structural reform may not promote growth and increase inequality will happen. But I would say, yes, that's a very general statement, but if I can go a little further, I will see the structural reform, in most cases, promote, number one, growth. I think there's clear evidence on those many issues, but also in many ways can support reduce inequality issues. For example, educational reform, right? Healthcare reform, financial inclusions, right? Bring the woman into the labor market. All those reforms can create a win-win situation, do the structural reform, support the growth, and support the reducing inequality issues. There are a few other issues they may have trade-off. Trade liberalization, product market reform, labor market reform, on those things, and the pension reform, which is a big issue in the US and all those countries. But we have case to say, even in these cases, if you have a proper package, if we can support by fiscal policy, for example, in pension reform, if you're moving away from the public hurdle, move to more personal private hurdle, obviously, you have to think about the redistributional factors. With the proper fiscal transformation, transfers, you will be able to maintain the Gini and the equity situations. So with the fiscal policy support, we probably will be getting both on the growth side and reduce inequality as well. But design the policy become more important. I saw Joe's checking. You disagree.
What I just want to say is, I think the first part of what Zhuming said is a major change in our understanding of inequality, because we always used to talk about the big trade-off, that the only way that you could get lower inequality was to give up on growth. The only way you could get more growth was to accept more inequality. And now we're aware that there are a very large number of reforms where you can get both. But there are some areas where you're going to face trade-offs, and that makes it a much more textured analysis.
I'm so glad, if I can jump in again, I'm so glad you support. I mean, because I understand take a risk and move a little away from your position. Yes, for example, we have a case in Malaysia. From 1985 to roughly 2005, Malaysia consecutively continues go through the 3 phases of reform. And in roughly 10, 15 years, the structural reform from trade liberalization, financial sector reform, market reform, labor market reform, and it goes through the whole thing. You will see the growth really pumped up, but productivity increased roughly 25%, Gini coefficient dropped 10 percentage points. There is case that show the world, if we have a proper policy package, policy mix, we can do it.
Winnie, I can see you sort of nodding. What are you making of what you're hearing?
Well, structural reforms that cut government spending that is supposed to support people living in poverty, and that shifts the burden of taxation and puts a higher burden of taxation on poor people, middle-class people. This kind of structural reform results in higher inequality, higher numbers of people living in poverty, and suffering of poor people. So we've seen that structural reforms, austerity in Europe, Oxfam came out with a report last year on austerity in Europe. Europe, that is a prosperous region as a result of its social model, we're seeing now that about 123 million people are at risk of falling in poverty in the European Union, and a further almost 25 million from across Europe also at risk of falling in poverty by 2025. if austerity measures continue. So for us, the question of the choice of reforms is a political one. It's a very political choice. Yes, there can be trade-offs, but then who decides on these trade-offs? And what are those trade-offs? We've seen that investing in quality health and education that is free for poor people is critical, not only as a virtual income for poor people, but also as an investment in the human potential. That diversifying economies like those of Latin America so that there are jobs in other sectors that people can work is critical. So I think the issue often is that there is political capture, that policies, these choices about what reforms will stimulate growth and also reduce poverty and inequality are being made by a few people who've captured the decision-making process. So we need to talk also about political capture, because today, money won't buy you a nice car, money won't just buy you even a yacht, but money can buy you favorable laws, money can buy you a pliant media, money can buy you impunity from justice, money can buy you an election and policies. So we have to talk about political capture.
I want to bring in Mexico's Finance Minister, Luis Videgaray. I mean, you heard there when you're talking about this idea of political capture. Obviously, Mexico is going through a process of reforms right now. Do you agree with this idea that there is that risk of political capture?
Well, first of all, I fully agree with Professor Stiglitz. The concept of structural reform is too broad of a basket to have a coherent discussion just on the concept. So we need to clarify what are we talking about. Second, whatever structural reform you make is always a political decision. It's particularly in a democracy. The way we've approached the process in Mexico is, first of all, when we use the term structural reform, the word structural refers mainly that there's going to be a relocation of resources and assets. And second, we push reforms forward. That means that this relocation will result in higher productivity, but just as important as higher productivity is to have a more democratic productivity. We call it a democratization of productivity. Because otherwise, the redistribution and relocation of resources and assets will result in a concentration of income and wealth. I'll give you 3 examples of reforms that we're pushing forward, and we're actually, we got them passed through Congress, and we're now in the implementation phase. Telecommunications reform. In Mexico, Mexico's been known for years as a country where there is a lack of competition in telecom, and who's suffering the most? Is suffering the poorest people, the farthest, the most lacked regions that have the most expensive and the least quality access to telecom. That is a really bad thing in the digital age. So that was, the structural reform there was about introducing competition in the telecom space. Education, it's all about quality of education. In a public education, free education model, but it's about quality. The fact that it's government-provided education should not mean that it's low-quality education. And that means teachers' evaluation, but also means having a lot more spending in the schools to have good schools where quality education can happen. So these means that these are structural reforms. And one thing that is important, if there's going to be true reallocation of resources, there's going to be an adjustment process. So the implementation phase is critical, because in the beginning, structural reforms oppose a lot of resistances. And there's anxiety and there's uncertainty in the process of reform. So these reforms shouldn't be measured by the immediate impact they have on growth, but what are the prospects for the country, both in terms of growth, productivity, and income equality in the years after the reforms are fully implemented.
So, I mean, is that when you're choosing which structural reforms, how much attention, how much weight do you give to the idea of the cost of inequality?
Well, I think you do reforms to foster both growth and equality. I fully agree with what Professor Stiglitz just said. There are reforms that will create inequality, but there are reforms that can create that can create at the same time growth and equality. We strongly believe that it's about spreading productivity. If you do reforms that will only increase productivity in certain pockets of the economy and certain regions, those reforms may result in more growth, probably not, but certainly will concentrate wealth. So it's about spreading productivity and particularly providing support to those regions and those segments of the markets that needs support. And these are quite, this can work with free markets. And we strongly believe that these are not necessarily a restriction to free markets, but the state has a role to play to create fairer, more equal markets.
Can I come in here? Because one of the important results of IMF research over the recent years, I know this should come from Xiumin, but I'll say it anyway. One of the areas of good research has been showing that, on average, countries with more inequality don't perform as well. They don't grow as well. They don't have growth spurts that are as long. And so if you make a series of structural reforms that aren't shared prosperity, not shared productivity, you're going to create more inequality. And you know from this historical experience that macroeconomic picture of more inequality is going to show up in either a shorter spurt of growth, less sustained growth. So I think you have to look at the inequality aspects if you're thinking about really structural reforms that are going to be lasting.
I can see you're keen to jump in.
Yes, because I think it has been very useful that the IMF has come out with research and reports that tell us of the link between inequality and growth and how extreme levels of inequality actually hurt long-term growth. But we can also look at it from another angle. There is strong correlation between high levels of inequality and social stability. In this region, the LAC region, which is the most unequal region in the world, there is a strong correlation between inequality and social violence. Of the 50 most violent cities in the world, 41 are from this region, 41 of them, with the highest rates of violent crime. So there is also that issue of social stability and its cost to growth of the violence and crime. And I think we should also look at, again, the issue of political capture. I want to return to it and give an example. I gave it yesterday, an example from Colombia. Between 2005 and 2010, every year, the mining companies were paying corporate income tax of about $450 million. But we're also getting back tax deductions, tax exemptions of up to $930 million. So for every tax collected from them, Colombia was losing $2 of uncollected tax. This is one of the reasons that fuels inequality in this region, that public policy has been really hijacked by some elites that are able to make laws, tax rules in their favor. In Nicaragua, some activities, economic activities, pay just 1% corporate tax, while an ordinary worker pays 31% from their salary in tax. That kind of regressivity in taxation is what is fueling, part of what is fueling inequality.
I mean, we're hearing a lot about the rewriting of international tax rules. Which reforms do work best, do you think, and how big a role is tax in that?
Well, this is another big subject about international taxation, which is a big issue in Addis, in the financing for development. Jill, you also participate in this one, and you and have a committee working on we are working on international taxation issues, and this is require a lot of global cooperation. I think this is very important. It's not only bring the private sector on board with authorities, tax authorities, but also bring all the country members together, understand the tax code, avoid the tax competition. I think there are many things. The company have to comply with the tax code. The authority have to avoid the tax competition. Those are things. But let me go back a little bit. Since wind energy also mentioned the IMF reports, so I'm very happy and honored, and thank you both. Our study showed clearly high inequality will dampen the growth. I think it's not a good thing for growth. And we also show lower inequality will support sustainable growth. So this is two different things, but also showed the inequality is really not good for growth. Our study also showed the structural reform have a strong aspect to support the growth across various sectors. As Joe mentioned, it's a big basket. But our new study also showed when you do the structural reform, you do have a trade-off, you have a choice. But with the proper policy, if you can compensate the loser, particularly the poor peoples, you will be able to do the structural reform to reach both growth and equity as well. In this country, Peru did a bundle structural reform in 1990s, and which paved the way for the strong growth in the first decades of its centuries, and also the income inequality and jobs. So I think that's also a good case.
I can see you're all wanting to jump in.
Well, I think that raises a big issue of the circumstances that are most conducive to reform. So that, for instance, if you have reforms that create unemployment and your economy is at a full employment, then people can move from unemployment to the new jobs, and that increases productivity. But if you have a structural reform where you already have, like in Greece, a 25% unemployment of 60% youth unemployment, when people get out of a job, you go from a low productivity sector to a zero productivity sector. That's negative growth. And if the problem in the country is a lack of aggregate demand, then those structural reforms that lower incomes, like those kinds that I just described, mean aggregate demand is going to be lower. And so that's an example where you'll hit twice. First, you'll have people more unemployed, and then the second round, you'll have a lack of aggregate demand, and those kinds of reforms are really bad. So you have to be very sensitive to the conditions as well as the nature of the structural reforms that you're doing.
I just want to bring in Minister Dijsselbloem here. There's been a lot of talk about Europe and the lack of demand and whether austerity policies were the right approach. I mean, just to respond to what we've been hearing there about that question of low demand, what is the right approach?
Well, if austerity was the only approach over the course of the Eurozone crisis, it would have been the wrong approach. So it was differentiated. We allowed countries more time than they initially had according to our fiscal rules. So it was done in quite a moderate way. But in the situation of Greece, of course, once the true figures were on the table, they had a deficit of 15%. I think that when you look at the Greek economy, there are some real structural issues to consider, both in how government and politics work, how public sector works, complete inefficiencies or sometimes even non-existence of legal frameworks that are crucial for a good business climate. There are major problems in the labor market. Large part of the economies have been given to monopolies, and big companies completely monopolize part of the economies, not paying taxes, a non-functioning of a fair tax system, etc., etc. All of these are structural issues. So you will have to deal with that for an economy like Greece to get back on track, for people to bring back their money, for people to start investing again. When I spoke to young unemployed people in Athens, one of the key things they told me that they wanted to start businesses, and it was so very, very difficult. You couldn't get through the bureaucracy, you couldn't get into all kinds of sectors of the economy. It was simply impossible for young people to start anything. if you don't open it up, if you don't deal with those structural issues, it's going to be very difficult to get the economy back on track.
But in the long term, absolutely. But in the short term, how do you deal with the rising inequality and that we're seeing right now?
Sorry, it's very difficult for me to hear.
In the long term, all of the reforms that you've been talking about need to be implemented. But in the short term, when you have such high unemployment, rising inequality, how do you implement some of those reforms without seeing rising inequality?
It's very, very difficult. To give you an example, the pension system in Greece is very unsustainable. It's one of the key issues. It also reflects negatively ongoing on the budget. The only way to do that is to gradually reform the pension system, but the solution certainly is not pushing that back and postponing it. The other way that I think we need to do is, at the same time, while we make the pension system more sustainable, work on a social welfare system, which is relatively underdeveloped, to put it mildly, in Greece, so that the immense social pressure that there is now on the pension system, complete families depend on the pensions, is sort of deleveraged. It requires different reforms at the same time. And actually, I believe that if you deal with a number of these issues in parallel, the effects of it will be mitigated and the positive return in terms of growth will be stronger. So there is a lot of work to be done, and more of these issues are of structural nature.
I agree with you, but I get worried when the IMF talks about compensating losers. Because what's happened, this austerity going on in Europe and the rising levels of inequality and poverty is a story that I know about. Because this is what we went through in Africa in the 80s and the 70s. And the World Bank had these cards that I remember that had PAPSCA written on them. That was called a program for the alleviation of poverty and the social costs of adjustment. Social costs of adjustment. If we look at it as an issue of compensating losers, but pursuing growth for growth's sake, but with some compensation of losers, we'll get it wrong. It didn't work. Poverty continued rising in Africa, and income stagnated, and it was miserable. I think we need to take a holistic view and look at what taxes and benefits do to the incomes and the living conditions of everybody, people living in poverty, and see the net effect. So it's about looking at the total picture of how you tax and also how you spend and what then, where a person is left when you have calculated all. But this siloed approach to reforms is not going to lift people out of poverty, and inequality is going to increase.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important points, and I think we'd all agree, is pacing and sequencing and the circumstances are absolutely critical. That when you have 60% youth unemployment, the effects are going to be very different than when you have full employment. What worries me a little bit is looking at the data and seeing the quarter century of lost Africa, growth in Africa, and the growth of inequality in Africa. When I look at the data, Spain was one of the countries where inequality was coming down before the crisis, and the way they responded. Now inequality is going up. You look at the inequality in Greece, it's going up. And you can relate that to some of the mistakes, I think, in the structural reforms and other policies. So for instance, one of the things that's now being asked of Greece is that by 2018, they have a 3.5% primary fiscal surplus. That's a recipe for depression. They're in depression, with GDP 25% below where it was. Any macroeconomist would have told you that. The IMF forecast, I don't want to, now that I gave you some compliments before, your forecast about what was going to happen were abysmal. The Troika forecast, I'm not sure, not yours, the Troika forecast were abysmal. They were abysmal in 2011, And what did you do then? You basically, when you saw the coefficient was lower, you used the same forecast for the next year. They were abysmal in the next year, and then they were abysmal the next year. So the basic thing is the model that you're using was clearly wrong. And part of it was wrong is that you didn't see these kinds of interactions that I've described. So let me just give one example that picks up on what was talked about, the big structural reform in Mexico, and contrast it with what's happening in Greece. Mexico did a really important structural reform in going after the big monopoly. See, they prioritized. They didn't say little grocery stores. They didn't, there are lots of. They went after Telmex, which was the big telephone monopoly that led to telephone prices 10 times as high as elsewhere. There are real problems of the oligarchs in Greece. But the little corner drugstores are not the major problem. And in fact, if you did something about that, you probably have big international drugstores come in and create more unemployment. They're having a debate now in Greece. They had a debate about how many days could milk be fresh.
Well, I can see Minister Dusselbaum shaking his head.
Just to respond to the example of the pharmacy shops. The main pharmacy shops are owned by two big oligarchs, and they own the majority of these shops. So it's not about a small SME we're talking about. We're talking about one of the monopolies in the society, which makes the costs of medicine in Greece a lot higher than the average for the Eurozone. So the example is all wrong. If it were true that they were all small shops, you could say, why are you bothered with the small shops? The small shops are owned by a couple of oligarchs who are keeping the prices for medicine for common people in Greece high. Now, I'm very sorry, but dealing with that is a social matter. It deals with inequality.
No, I agree, but the question is, how do you deal with it? Do you bring in foreign big oligopolies, or do you try to break it up and make sure that there are no oligopolies within the country?
Let me try to argue with our dear professor again. I know I'm taking risk, but it's not easy to argue with Joe Stiglitz, of course, and Nobel Prize winner. But let me try. On Greece case, I think the first issues will have to be clear. It is not a failure of a structural reform. It is a non-successful of incomplete structural reform. In Greece, we try to do the labor market reform. It's not a finish, but it started with somewhere increased competition. But then they stopped, there's no product market reform. To use your theory, you increase competition in the labor market, you enhance the competitiveness, reduce the wage, which is internal devaluation.
So it's only down 25%. You want it to fall more than 25%.
I'll come back to that point. But the second issue is if you don't have product market reform, right, and you don't have a pension reform, you still can improve the competitiveness for the whole economy and for the whole industry. I think they have to go together, but unfortunately, the structural reform only started, never finished. I think that's the first issue, very important. The second issue is, I agree with you, the environment, the conducive is very important. And when you have 25% unemployment, it's very difficult to carry out labor market reform. But when the macro issues, if you don't have aggregate demand space, you don't have a fiscal policy space, you don't have a monetary policy space, I think the only thing you can do is to go back to the supply side reform, do structural reform. It's not easy, but we see so many different cases in different countries with the package, with the proper fiscal policy support to compensate the other sides, we probably will be able to go through. I think we should not emphasize the failure of a structural reform in Greece. It's just the reform never, ever complete.
I want to go back to a point you made about priority
you
and put that question.
You disagree?
I disagree.
I don't want us to talk too much about Greece. I want to move it back to Mexico. I mean, this idea of prioritizing which reforms work best. How did you decide what order, which ones were the ones that would get you the most bang for the buck?
In the end, choosing reforms is always something that does not happen in a vacuum. It happens in a political context, and these are political decisions. But the political process should drive should not be in the driver's seat. It's your public policy convictions that should work within a political setup. And for instance, let me talk about tax reform we did in Mexico. For years, the private sector had been advocating for introducing a VAT on food. In Mexico, we don't have VAT on food. Instead of doing that, what we did was a tax reform that made more progressive the income tax. And we particularly closed loopholes for large corporations to pay more taxes, and we did not introduce a tax on food. Why did we do that? It was not based purely on efficiency. Any textbook economics will tell you that probably it would have been more efficient to tax food and not address the problems on the corporate income tax. But we did the opposite. We didn't do it because of distribution concerns. Because if you tax food in a country like Mexico that is already quite unequal, you would increase inequality. Because 50% of the monthly expenses of a poor family in Mexico go to food. So it's not only about growth and productivity. You need to keep a fundamental priority on distribution. And by the way, just a comment on something that has just happened here in Lima yesterday. Yesterday, G20 countries fully endorsed something done by the OECD, which is called BEPS. It's a project on limiting base erosion and profit shifting. For a country like Mexico or any emerging market country, this is extremely relevant because a lot of tax evasion came from multinationals. A company that has been in Mexico for 30 years, has 10,000 employees, and has not paid taxes in a decade because they don't make a profit there. And the reason is not really that they don't make a profit, but the profits are shifted somewhere else where the tax is lower. So the achievement by the OECD and the full endorsement by G20 countries on BEPS that just happened yesterday and was announced this morning is a major achievement, not only for better tax collection, but also for equality and fairness.
I mean, I'm surprised. Nobody here, when talking about reforms, we've heard about education, about tax. Nobody has mentioned infrastructure.
No one has mentioned what? Sorry?
Infrastructure projects as a way to help boost growth, create jobs. Is that sort of less of a popular option in terms of a kind of reform that can help deal with address both of these challenges?
Yeah, the answer is yes. I think we all understand and we all support it here, so nobody talk about that now so far, which is good news. We published the big paper argue infrastructure will support the growth and improve the income equality issues, and because it helped the infrastructure reach to the poor, to the mountain areas, and also in the medium term, most importantly, not in the short term to support aggregate demand, but in the medium and long term to support the productivity increase. So we actually encourage all authorities in this difficult to scale up infrastructure investments.
I will say something on infrastructure, but before I do, I just wanted to react to Minister, I'm going to say that name wrong, Vidagurai, that Latin American Caribbean region has really lost its golden opportunity, that these years of high commodity prices and high growth for it, that the region has not been able to shift and create jobs in other sectors for people. But now that the region is facing almost zero growth, very low growth, the temptation to cut social spending, cut the investments in health and education and social protection should be resisted. This is a time to continue to share the growth broadly and to keep the investments to lift people out of poverty. And the way to do this really is that this region is also one of the most cheated regions in the world, that there is money that should be collected as revenue that isn't collected because of the tax loopholes in the system. Yes, BEPS is good, it's just a first step. We need more reform of the global corporate tax system that will then give opportunity for Mexico and the countries of this region to collect their fair share of taxes that they can then plow back into the economy and diversify. But on infrastructure, I think one big issue here in Latin America too is that you have a well-educated population, men and women. Women in this region graduate as well as men, sometimes more, from the universities, but with a very low female labor force participation. And that is to do with the fact that really you don't invest well in compensating for unpaid care work that women do. That women stay at home because they have to make a choice between caring and staying in employment. So if you could invest in childcare, in infrastructure, in public transportation in cities, and enable women to keep a job and also care for their families, you could be contributing to more growth and reducing inequality between men and women.
Now, we want to leave time to take questions from the audience, so if you want to quickly...
Yeah, a quick comeback. Gosh, I feel very risky. I have to argue with the lady again.
Okay.
The first issue is, yes, the Latin American region facing tremendous challenges because the super commodity cycle is ending, and the global growth is weakening, and emerging market growth is slow, particularly China and a few other countries. So external demand is weak, so they are challenges. But I don't think they missed all the opportunities. I don't think it's a doomed situation. The region has good capacities, and they do adjust their monetary policy, fiscal policy. We see the region will pick up. The next years, the growth will be stronger. And I think we do see the region will have good potential because the human resource, and the good macro foundations that have been built in the past 10 years. Now, the second issue is, even in these short-term difficult times, we don't recommend them to cut the public expenditures, particularly on education, health, all those issues. And we do recommend them to play and build a social safety net floor to protect the poor. I think the authorities in the region actually are taking policies, doing those things, ensure in the difficult time they will be able to help the poor and the minority and the women and as a group as well. So I think we do looking positively and for the region.
I think we're going to have to pause there to take some questions for the audience. So I don't know if there are microphones, but I can see a hand up already there. The lady, if you could identify yourself and say who the question is for. I think there's a microphone just coming over.
Alicia Salgado.
About Mr. Stiglitz, do you know about the creation of special zones for industrialized poverty states in Mexico? How do you think it could be served, and even to Mr. Videgaray? Why do you do the government elect this option to make a playing field for development of the North states linked to the United States and the South states that are the poorest one in the country?
Mr. Videgaray.
Let me answer first. We just introduced in Mexico a proposal to Congress to create special economic development zones in southern Mexico. The reason for this is that 20 years ago, when NAFTA was enacted, it was a very good thing for the country overall. But if you look closer, it was a very good thing for the central and northern part of the country, where NAFTA is a story about prosperity. But for southern Mexico, it's a story of stagnation. And the way, the policy approach of the past 20 years for the Mexican South has been basically certain variations of the compensating losers approach. By giving handouts for poverty alleviation. That certainly, we believe, is not a sustainable strategy. The South needs a strategy, a public policy approach, of active industrial policy, of developing industry and creating competitivity and well-paid jobs in the South. not just having a poor South and a prosperous North. And that means a different intervention. I mean, there are, the special economic zones are just part of a strategy. These are zones that have worked well. There were 3,500 special economic zones around the world. Some work very well, some do not. But it's an approach, it's a tool to creating something that goes beyond just compensating losers. And by losers in Mexico, we talk about a large region in the South.
And if I could take another question, I don't know if I can see, yes, the gentleman there. I think there is a...
not apply to Peru.
And so your question?
Well, it's a statement. So the example is kind of far-fetched and can lead to misleadings and confusions and wrong interpretations. It's not a question. This is a statement of fact.
I would like to give you another statistic. Well, it's good if Peru is collecting its taxes due to it from the minerals that it exports. That would be great. But let me give you just another example. You heard of the Swiss leaks, the HSBC bank scandal. In that scandal, it was found that residents from this region, just in that one scandal, residents from this region had kept in HSBC Bank $52 billion. That is equivalent to about 26% of the, or 24% of the entire health budget of this region. Think about that. This is money stashed away in a tax haven that could be taxed to go into the health systems of your country, Peru, and other countries, but is not coming back. So and that's just one scandal with one bank in 1 year. So think about how much the region is losing in terms of the money that it could tax and put into health, into education, into social protection, into new jobs. So it's a serious problem. BEPS has made a good start, but we are calling for a second generation of reforms that are going to be able to tackle tax competition that IMF mentioned just now, that's going to tackle the issue of tax havens and the issue of taxing at source, Peru being able to collect its fair share. So it is a problem for Peru, I'm sorry to say.
Hello, I have a question here.
Gentleman there on the fifth row.
Yes, hello. And just a second, I have a question. My name is Alberto Maure, and I'm head of the National Institute of Agricultural Research here in Peru. It's for all the panelists. No one touched the subject that one of the biggest risks of inequality is that the elite in an unequal society will do everything in its power to perpetuate itself. Thank you.
And sorry, who was the question for?
It was for all panelists, and I will explain a little bit more. The biggest risk of an unequal society is that it will try to perpetuate itself as an unequal society because the elite will do everything in its power to bend the political system to its own purposes.
Yeah, I think I understand. Okay. I mean, what we know is that much of the inequality in our societies is a result of the way we write the rules of the game. That, markets don't exist in a vacuum. Some people say, leave it to the markets. But markets are a result of rules about how labor, whether you have antitrust, how effectively you enforce antitrust, corporate governance, whether the CEOs can extract all that money, whether the financial sector can engage in all kinds of shenanigans that we saw in the United States. So inequality, we now know, is largely determined by those rules. And that's one of the reasons why you see, say, across the advanced countries, all of which have similar economies, huge differences in equality between the Scandinavian on the one hand and the United States on the other, with the highest level of inequality. The problem is that in our democracies, inevitably, when you have high levels of inequality, economic inequality as we have, that translates into political inequality. And that political inequality then is used to perpetuate the rules that maintain the economic inequality. It was a real achievement in Mexico that they were able to reform the telecom sector. Because, you know, not an accident, number 2 person in the Forbes list of the wealthiest people had a connection with that sector. And it was a result of privatization. Important lesson about if you don't do privatizations well, you create pockets of market power that perpetuate itself. So I think it's very, very much to the point that we can't think about economic inequality and separate it out from the social dimensions that you were talking about. Those were some of the rules, and the political dimensions of inequality.
Fantastic. Next question there, the lady, yeah.
Yes, good afternoon. I'm Fabiola from the World Bank. My question could go to any of you. How can we increase inequality without challenging the normal market activity, which could be the incentives for the private sector not to fear of these structural reforms? Thank you.
I couldn't hear.
So I don't know if you, sorry, if
difficult
you
for me
wouldn't mind repeating again.
Yeah.
Yes. Which could be the incentives for the private sector not to fear these structural reforms, because they could indeed think that these reforms can decrease their incomes?
So I don't know if you heard that. It was the incentives.
I try to answer your question if I hear correctly. I think the structural reform actually in general will enhance the market competition. So, which is good for private sector, and good for productivity increase, and good for the competition. So in that sense, and this is very much a market approach, because it's just to reduce, for example, many financial sector structural reform is reduce regulations, and also on the product markets also reduce regulations, and it's very much show the pro market release the potential productivity as well. So I don't think it's against the private sector issue.
I think I want to return to, in answering your question, to return to the point that Professor Stiglitz has just made, that inequality is a result of public policies, public choices, and that a different set of choices can reduce inequality. And as we've learned also from the IMF, you can be increasing growth as you reduce inequality. But for that to happen, we have to tackle this issue of political capture, that public policies are shaped by a small economic elite that's connected to a political elite. So we have to push for public policies being made in a space where not just the private sector, but also citizens can voice and can influence those choices. So we have to be talking about reforms that will give us a free and independent media, citizens' rights to express themselves, to assemble and to challenge and to offer their solutions. And we have to reduce this issue of lobbying. We have to have anti-lobbying laws. We've got to reduce the power of companies to shape the rules of the game. Right now, it's so legal for them. Companies in Europe in the financial sector pay $150 million every year to influence European Union institutions. And the main issue they are lobbying about, I can tell you, is about taxation. Health companies, pharmaceutical companies, $50 million too. We have to reduce that. That is a voice that they give themselves through laws to shape the rules of the game.
And going back to the question about the sort of power of a duopoly, what were the lessons you learned when you tried to tackle that?
Well, I just want to say that in trying to answer the question, it is the private sector at the end that creates wealth. It's not the government. But you want the private sector to be focused on creating value, not in rent-seeking activities. And unfortunately, in a region like Latin America and in many other regions in the world, there is a lot of talent, energy, and innovation based on rent-seeking, on either be tax, rents, regulatory unfair advantages, or just sheer monopolies. So if you want to sum up, in my view, what kind of structural reforms would be those that foster growth at the same time that they foster a more equal society, would be those that change the rules so that the private sector focuses all its energy, creativity, and intellectual power in creating value for society rather than capturing any kind of rent.
I mean, in terms of rewriting the rules, is there a case of one size fits all that you can apply to different countries, or does it have to be specific?
Well, can I just make two very brief comments? One, I totally agree with what you said, except for one minor point, which is there is this idea that the private sector is the source of wealth creation. And if you look very deeply into the big innovations which have really been the basis of wealth, the discovery of DNA, laser, transistor, the internet, those are all public sector innovations. The private sector is the one that takes those innovations and brings them to the market. You know, the government can't do that, but we have to remember that the public sector has played a critical role. And the not-for-profit sector, of which I'm a part in a sense, the not-for-profit universities, which, you know, are really, I would say, a major part of the source of value and the most important in the United States. The second one I like to comment is we're talking about this issue of democratic participation in the decision making. One important part of that is we have to know what the government is doing, and that's where the right to know laws. But right now, we've been engaged in a major aspect of rulemaking, rules that govern, called TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, and in Europe, TPIP. Totally secret. Businesses have been at the table, but not civil society, not ordinary citizens. And the agreement has been completed, and we still don't know. And that is an example, I think an extreme example of where there's been a failure in the democratic process and where it's been captured to create a set of rules that work for a small group, but I think it inevitably is going to create more inequality in our society.
Now, I'm afraid we are out of time, so I will have one question which I would like all of you to answer as briefly as possible to sort of sum up. Which reforms, if you had to pick your top three, do you think would be most pro-poor, or is that sort of too simplistic a way? If I could start with you, Winnie.
The types of reforms that it would depend on the level of wealth in the country, the kind of economy they have. They will vary. But certainly investments in health and education, public health and education, are critical. Free, quality public health and education. Wages, a minimum wage for workers, and the right to negotiate terms and conditions of work, I think is critical for lifting people out of poverty and reducing inequality. Social protection, but most of all, we have to break the political capture. We can't make these policies outside a framework that is democratic, that is transparent, that enables ordinary people to shape public policy.
2 points. The first issue is, since we're living in the world changes so fast, and everyone should emphasize the structural reform on education systems. I agree with you, healthcare systems, pension systems, and to bring gender issues, bring more women to the market, and which is also an important issue. Financial inclusions and related reforms. I think everyone should do that, and I think those are very important, promote both growth and reduce inequality. But the second issue is a slightly different the age of development. For low-income countries, for example, agriculture, still the key. Trade, still the key. But for emerging market, they move to the product market, financial sector reform. For the advanced economy, they move more to the R&D sort of rule and law, popularize those things, and move into the service sector reform as well. And so different countries in the different development stage may have a different task.
So I agree with everything that everybody has said so far, including the fact that obviously what's most important will depend on the stage of development, the circumstances of the country. But to add a couple, 3 points to that. The first is, or the overall framework is that we need to rewrite the rules of the market economy to make it more equal, that it's the way we structure the market economy. And of the rules that I think are most important, there are 3 I would mention. First, giving workers more rights, which would actually make them participate more in some of the key decision makings, making sure that women can participate more in the labor force, public transportation that will bring them to the jobs more easily. Secondly, reforms of the antitrust laws and the corporate governance that result in the current regime, particularly in the United States and Europe, in a regime where you have a few people taking a lot, but leading to slower growth because it's created a system of short-term thinking where everybody's thinking about the quarterly return, and you can't get sustainable growth if you're thinking about a quarterly return. And finally, taming the financial sector, reforming the financial sector so this, all the reforms in financial sectors, structural reforms, have been trying to prevent the financial sector from harming the rest of our economy. Excessive risk-taking, market manipulation, predatory lending. What I think we ought to be doing is trying to make sure the financial sector serves the rest of our economy. It's supposed to serve the real sector rather than us serving them. So these are examples. I know you want me to stop, but there's a whole book here called Rewriting the Rules.
And a plug in there.
Of course, not for profit, of course, not for profit.
It is actually not for profit. It's available, not even intellectual property right, because we want a dissemination. This is about ideas getting out there, and you can download it at the Roosevelt Institute website.
I would say
your email address.
To add to what others have already said, I would say that the key issue is about access and opportunity. And it very much depends, of course, per country. In some countries, the key point about creating opportunities is the educational system, simply allowing access also from all different social classes to the educational system. Sometimes it's about the tax system to allow participation and to stimulate participation in the economy of all groups involved. Sometimes it's about the labor market. In the Eurozone countries, very often it's about the labor market. Allowing access for young people in the labor market is a crucial issue. We have protected our labor market so much that there are insiders and outsiders. That's a key issue in Europe. So access and opportunity, that is the key issue, I think, when you look at structural reforms.
In Mexico, we've done the past 2 years and a half, 13 structural reforms. And I'm often asked which one is the most important. As Minister of Finance, I'm always tempted to say tax reform or financial reform, but that's not true. We've done a very important telecom reform that both Professor Stiglitz and I referred to. There's the energy reform, which is huge. But certainly the most important reform out of those 13 is the education reform. Why? Because it's a reform that is long-lasting, and it's good for growth, but it's also very good for equality. Because it's a reform about bringing quality to public free access education throughout the country.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to thank the panel very much. Mexico's Finance Minister, Luis Videgaray, the Dutch Finance Minister, Jeroen Dijsselbloem, Joseph Stiglitz, you've held up that book enough, Minzu from the IMF, and Winnie Benyama from Oxfam International. Thank you very much to all of our panel.